The sun is shining. Not really. The birds are chirping. It's going to be a great fucking day. And this is Dog Shirt TV special morning edition. We're going to try this. I've never done it before. But you know, we're trying all kinds of things. I've got my morning coffee here. I've got a guest who's going to show up at some point, like now or anytime, and you know, we're gonna work on this because you know I'm aware that that uh, here she is. I'm aware that you know, morning shows are a thing. They're famous. Morning Joe, you know, that sort of thing. And so I thought, you know, me drinking my morning coffee, having a chat with an interesting person in a different time zone would be cool. And so here we are. And we have a special guest from a war zone. And you can see from her background that it's very dangerous there. Yeah. So let me spend a moment introducing Nastya, who's supposed to be drinking wine, but appears to be drinking water. So this is the first of what may turn into a series or may not, depending on whether we like doing it and whether people like watching it, and that we're calling Kava y Vino. And Kava is coffee, and Vino is, as it is in so many languages, wine. And Nastya is about to correct my pronunciation because my pronunciation sucks.
No, it's good
No?
enough. It's
Good
Vino.
enough?
Yeah,
Vino.
you said it right.
Yeah, so the Ukrainian Y sound is very hard for me. I have a lot of trouble with it.
Not just you, most
Yeah,
for
it's a hard noise. And so but the theory is at 8 o'clock in the morning Washington time, which I think is 3 o'clock Kyiv time.
Yeah.
So that is a good time for morning coffee and an afternoon glass of wine. And so here we are. Nastya, as you may know or may not know, is doing a major project for Lawfare, which we're going to talk a little bit about. And it's a podcast project. She is also a former reporter for the Kyiv Independent, and the author of the very important Yours Ukrainian Substack, which every single one of you should also subscribe to. And yeah, so Nastya, how's the war zone?
The war zone is getting chilly. We started having our first fall days. It's been really windy, cold. I'm like stacked up on proper sweaters. So yeah, that's like the major Kyiv update. There are a bunch of other updates which we can get into later. I mean, about just like the mood in Kyiv and what's in the news, and yeah, like Zelensky's trip. There's a lot in the news that can be unpacked. There's also a lot that should be in the news but isn't. So
right. So let's this is you know, a formless hour. The only thing that we need to cover this hour, and by the way, people who are joining us, if you have a question, just jump in.
Is this sort of a live situation? I don't know.
This is a live situation. There is a local audience here on Riverside that will be that people can join us from. There's also, it's being routed to YouTube as we speak.
Wow.
And then well, I did call it a live stream.
Yeah, you're right. But Riverside doesn't register to me as a live stream platform, right? Because I use it for work.
It's a
So
really good live streaming platform, actually. Now, if you have questions, just jump in, signal me that you have a question, and and of course, we also post these to the In Lieu of Fun um,
cool.
uh, uh, podcast feed. All right, so the first thing we got to cover is we got to talk about your project for Lawfare because I heard the sizzle reel for it the other day, and it was, I think the term is fucking great. And so uh, we haven't really talked publicly about the project, but I
Yeah.
think this is a good chance to do it. So what are we doing?
We are making a narrative podcast about the history of US Ukraine relations and kind of going through every important episode in Ukrainian history and how Americans were reacting to it, how they were thinking about it, and how it ultimately led us to the point where we are now, which is a very difficult point in time for Ukraine. And it's very interesting because there isn't any good kind of broad audience pop content on it. There are like two academic books on this subject, but that's pretty much it. There are no like mainstream books, no podcasts, so we're the first ones doing this kind of thing. So yeah, it's very exciting. We're interviewing a lot of really high level folks, both in Ukraine and in the US. And I think it's just a very necessary product, and all of these conversations that we're having are extremely important because there is so much misunderstanding between US and Ukraine, and this is just my broad takeaway from like this year. I'd say just ever since I started working for Lawfare and kind of working with Americans and conversing and talking to them like on a daily basis, all while sitting in Kyiv. It's kind of the perfect place for me to kind of see the broad picture of this relationship and experience firsthand the misunderstanding that's happening every single day. So I think this podcast is going to try to shine light on a bit of that and just maybe bridge this gap a little bit, so people, perhaps if they feel some hostility one way or the other, that they maybe lower that and understand the other side a bit more. I think it's very necessary.
Yeah, so Americans often, I think, don't perceive that there is this kind of pervasive Ukrainian American misunderstanding that you're describing.
Very true.
Um,
I think
and
people think that we're just allies and we're on the same page and America saved us from Russia. And in Kyiv, it's definitely not like that at all.
yeah, so describe like how would you describe the basic, you know, I don't know if Americans are from Mars and Ukrainians are from Venus or vice versa, maybe
Yeah.
the opposite. Um, but what is the ships passing in the night quality here?
Well, so the problem is that as I already said, the US thinks of itself in these grandeur savior terms that, Biden rallied 50 nations before the war and NATO came together. And as he said in the infamous debate, stopped Putin, well, apparently. And that's how Washington perceives it. But for Ukraine, the US was never doing enough to actually help us. The US is continuously being way too slow, way too cautious vis-a-vis Russia, trying to not provoke Russia, trying to not cause an escalation with Russia. And this conflict is really making like thousands of Ukrainians genuinely believe that the US doesn't want Ukraine to win. This is kind of like a mainstream, I'd say, opinion. I mean, I don't have data to back it up, but from every conversation I have, that's what most people ascribe to. Is that in the beginning of the war, people thought that maybe the US just wants to kind of use Ukraine as a proxy to fight Russia and like kind of drown Russian resources. So basically, we were making the US's main adversary weaker without the US stepping, a single foot of a soldier in here, which is true. but we are actively doing that. But Ukrainians in the beginning of the war kind of thought that like that was the dynamic, that that the US isn't interested in a quick victory because they want Russia to lose as many resources as possible. But now that opinion kind of switched to like the US is just being weak and kind of, not Churchillian enough, and, trying to appease and trying to search for some sort of peace solution where there isn't any, and is so scared of these nuclear threats from Putin that, the US doesn't want us to win because, humiliating Russia and destroying Russian military capabilities, that would be too much, too dangerous, too unpredictable, and so on. And it generates huge amounts of anger. I mean, people are of course grateful, but being grateful isn't like the first emotion that comes to mind. If you ask someone like how they feel about the US, I think pretty much universally everyone is very frustrated. So yeah,
it's so interesting. I think there's a
and I think also, sorry, I'll interject. I also think that Americans are completely unaware of this. I mean, I met with two former White House officials today, and they said that upon their arrival in Kyiv and talking to people about this, they were completely surprised that people are so mad. So people are not aware of this. It's a problem.
Yeah, I think there's a hello, Evgamon.
Hey.
We are now a tri-country live stream. Ev is joining from Ottawa. So I think there's a reciprocal misunderstanding that pervades the US side that Ukrainians are often unaware of, which is that Ukrainians tend to see their post-Soviet history as a sort of continuous struggle against Russia. Whereas Americans look at Ukraine and say, wow, Ukraine has really vacillated between sometimes pro-Russian forces like sometimes Kuchma and Yanukovych and pro-Western forces. And so there's a sort of like, unlike Estonia or Poland, well, Poland's sort of complicated too now, there's, which Ukraine shows up at the table depends on which sort of 5-year period that you're talking about. And so post 2014, Ukrainians have really expected Americans to assume that Ukraine is, a pro-Western actor, but it hasn't always been. And so there's a sort of confusion about, like, is the Ukraine that's showing up the sort of basket case of the 90s or the authoritarian Yanukovych era Ukraine, or is it the Euromaidan Ukraine? And Ukrainians seem to gloss over that, but
Yeah.
it's a genuinely confusing thing for American policymakers and analysts.
I mean, it's a difficult question, especially now that where I'm unpacking all of this history for the project that we're doing. The one thing that frustrates me is, and I'm sure my frustration would be less if I knew the in and outs of like how this analysis was done in the moment, but at least now, what frustrates me is that it seems like the Americans have always glossed over how Russia has been treating us. So it's not so much as where we stood as a country, as like a majority of Ukrainians, whether they want to join NATO or not, but it's more of like, what seems obvious is that Russia has always been aggressive towards us or colonial towards us. So that's kind of the part that I wish more people understood earlier on, because Russia has been treating us kind of as a colony always, period. Like, regardless of whoever was in Kyiv, regardless of the president, Russia has always tried to, monopolize all of our spheres in terms of like the Russian language and pro-Russian policies and economics and politics. So it was always a question of like, which president are we going to get and how that president is going to approach that neo-colonial attitudes. But the Russian neo-colonial attitudes never went away. And so that's, I think, the part that kind of, it frustrates me that Americans didn't seem to care or didn't seem to really see it. Like, for them, they thought that, maybe that's just like a post-colonial kind of post-Soviet Union dynamic that's fine with everyone, that Ukrainians are okay with that and the Russians are happy and everyone's happy and everything's fine. But it's not. I mean, yeah, so that's just kind of how I look at it in that sense.
So, all right, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about your other cool project, which I have added to your name in the bottom of your screen. Tell us a little bit about Yours Ukrainian, which listeners of the Dog Shirt Daily podcast, Read With Me, will know a little bit about, but tell us more. What have you been doing?
Yeah, so several months ago, I've started a Substack, which has been really fun because I get to kind of write more informally and more opinionated than I would otherwise, for Lawfare or before I joined Lawfare. So I do a weekly briefing of the most important news of the week, and then I also do periodic essays, like long form deep dives into something I've written about. For example, the rise of, well, actually, I didn't write about that. I commissioned a good friend of mine who's qualified to write about it, to write about the rise of the Wagner Group. I've written about Yeltsin, about the literature, kind of bookstore culture in Kyiv, and just a bunch of other really cool stuff about a political murder of a very controversial political figure in Ukraine. So it's fun. I like that I have this kind of cool, informal-ish space where I need to be serious enough because people are actually interested in the news, and I'm a journalist, and I need to give them, proper professional content. But I can also show my opinion and kind of ponder questions that I have, and it's very fun that I can take it wherever I want to take it. So you guys should subscribe. It's very cool, in my humble opinion.
All right. So that's an action item number one. We would say subscribe to the podcast, except the podcast doesn't exist yet. We're going to be releasing the sizzle reel pretty soon. So that will be on the Lawfare Presents feed, where we did the aftermath and allies and the report. So, get ready for that. It's coming. Your latest piece. Let's talk about it. This is on Lawfare as of yesterday. Give us the lowdown.
So Zelensky had a very high stakes trip to the United States last week. He spoke at the United Nations Security Council. He spoke at the General Assembly. He met a bunch of leaders, during the UN meetings. He, most importantly, met Biden, Harris, and Trump, and presented what he refers to as Ukraine's victory plan. And it was a very long week, as I wrote in my Substack overview of this, because every day something was happening, and then every day you were kind of expecting more and more and more, and you were interested to see like what's going to happen, because of course the media was reporting various anonymous comments and leaks about the reactions that some officials have. So like the whole week you're reading that everyone in the US is apparently unimpressed with Zelensky's victory plan. So that's not very good if you're Ukrainian. And then there's also this whole Republican drama that I describe in the piece that happened, right? So Zelensky visited a army ammunition plant in Scranton, and several days after that visit, the Speaker of the House demanded that Zelensky fires Oksana Markarova, who is our Ukrainian ambassador into the US. She's extremely popular, very well respected. Everyone loves her, but
including me. I'm a big Markarova fan.
yes. So yeah, but Johnson said that she needs to be fired because apparently he accuses her of organizing.
Johnson's wrong. Don't do it.
He accuses her of organizing this Zelensky trip to Scranton without inviting any Republicans, supposedly. Because he only had 3 Democrats there with him. So Shapiro, who is the governor of Pennsylvania, where the visit took place, and then also the local Congress representative, and then another Scranton-born politician, a senator. So
senator, the senator from the state. I mean, he had the 3 relevant people: the representative, the senator, or one of the 2 senators, and the governor. They just all happen to be Democrats. It's not like
And so Johnson went as far as to say that this was election interference, which, I mean, mind-boggling, to be honest. Like
projection.
Basically, he needs to unpack that with his therapist or something, because, I mean, they took so much offense, not only because they're just kind of annoyed at Zelensky and the comments he made about Trump. We can unpack that a little bit later. But it's also because Pennsylvania is, of course, a swing state. It's super important. It's a kind of state that can decide the election. And not only is it Pennsylvania, which is a swing state, the state also has I think 700,000 Polish Americans, and also like hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. And all of them care about Russia's war and the US supporting Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine is like a very big issue for people there. And judging by the fact that Trump won and lost the last previous elections by like a matter of, correct me if I'm wrong, like tens of thousands of votes, if those Polish citizens or Polish Americans or Ukrainians vote one way or the other, they definitely could decide the election pretty much, which is, I think, why Republicans were so touchy-feely about this whole visit, that, as if they're trying to meddle in some sort of partisan campaign thing. I mean, a part of me gets it, because it is such a high-stakes moment in such a high-stakes state. Another part of me is and I told you this, Ben, this is only an issue if you're trying to look for one, right? So because all of these people, they're directly related to the state. They're not I don't know, a bunch of other, they're not like Nancy Pelosi riding around the United States with Zelensky campaigning or something like that. They're very specific people who are local politicians. So I think it would kind of be weird if, a very important politician like Zelensky show up to your state and use a governor you didn't come and make an appearance, right? So that's weird also. At the same time, I understand that, okay, I'm not sure who was the one planning this visit. Given the power dynamics in Ukraine, it was probably the president's office, because they're the guys who decide pretty much everything these days. It is kind of a mess up. They should have understood.
Should have had a Republican there.
Because I mean, they should have understood the local context a bit better. It was also the whole thing. I mean, the whole thing was kind of backdropped by the fact that on Monday, or actually on Sunday, as Zelensky literally landed in the US, New Yorker released an interview with him on that particular day, in which they interviewed him about the victory plan, and also asked what he thinks about Trump and his running mate Vance. And Zelensky was not holding back for the first time in many months. And Ukrainian officials would be very, very cautious with both kind of potential administrations. But Zelensky finally shot back, and he was like, Vance is too radical, and neither Vance nor Trump know what they're talking about. I'm not quoting here. I'm putting my own words in their mouths. But basically, yeah, I mean, that timing of that particular interview definitely didn't help the trip, because from now on, everything went kind of downhill from there, because Trump was mad, Vance was mad, Republicans were mad, and yeah, it was just kind of a big mess. So,
Ev?
Sorry. Yes, sorry. While we're on the topic of Trump, so there was a clip where the two of them, like Zelensky and Trump, were together. Can you kind of explain and unpack the background, how the Zelensky's reaction to Trump talking about the impeachment was perceived in Ukraine?
that's a good question. I mean, I haven't seen anyone talk specifically about that part of the meeting. Like, I haven't seen much reaction to Trump saying another lie. He said that Zelensky apparently helped Trump avoid impeachment because he said that Trump did nothing wrong, which, I mean, I wasn't following it very closely years ago, but everyone who understands this has now written that, like, this is false. Zelensky never said this. What obviously was more of a reaction is the fact that Ukraine was accused of election interference, which, I mean, most Ukrainians just thought is completely crazy. And I think, Ben, you and I are being more understanding of all of this, because we kind of understand the American context, and we see that, like, okay, well, it's not that big of a deal, but they really could have invited a Republican to, like, smooth it out. No, I haven't seen anybody talk about that. I think everyone is just really mad at Republicans and at this, like, crazy rhetoric, and the fact that, like, Russia actually interfered in the elections, and now Republicans somehow became a pro-Russian party, which, I mean, if you had asked somebody about this like 15 years ago, they would laugh, right? Which is another kind of switch that we could unpack later, Ben, if you want. I'm really curious on how that unfolded. But yeah, everyone in Ukraine is like, are you kidding? Like, really?
Well, I mean, that's the appropriate reaction for Ukrainians. You know, their job is not to say, you know, is not to critique the stage management of a particular event where Zelensky visits an arms manufacturing plant that's literally making artillery shells for the Ukrainian military. It's not, you know, like, it's not the job of the average Ukrainian voter or politician, or, you know, to think about how that is managed.
Mm-hmm.
It's perfectly appropriate for people to be simply annoyed or outraged or somewhere in between that the president of Ukraine goes to a manufacturing plant to thank the workers there. I mean, you know, it's not a
literally the purpose. Yeah,
it was clearly the purpose, and it becomes a political football in the United States by a major party. And by the way, historically, the party that would have been, you know, that a lot of Ukrainians would have identified with as the sort of more, you know, more interested in sort of muscular military policy overseas. And so I don't think it's really Ukrainians' job to be thinking through the sort of nuances of how Zelensky should present himself in the American context. I think it's perfectly appropriate for people to be like, WTF, Speaker Johnson, you know, like, the president comes and visits you and you demand Markarov's head. I mean, it's outrageous.
It's also outrageous because Zelensky went to Utah in the summer and met with the local Republican governor and a bunch of other Republicans, I believe, and no one gave a crap. And, like, nothing happened. And it was like a very much like red stage Republican kind of visit. And that was appropriate, right? So, I mean, yeah, I do think, though, that Ukrainians need to understand the American context a lot better, which goes right back to the conversation with which we started. That there
Right,
is
but that's an issue with the president. I mean, whoever organized that event, whether it was Markarova and her people or the president's office itself, I mean, whoever did it,
yeah,
should have included a Republican. I mean, they should have brought Mitch McConnell, who's
who loves Ukraine
who
and
loves Ukraine and is very happy to be the bipartisan face, because
yeah,
he's trying genuinely and earnestly. My enthusiasm for him, I assure you, is under control. But on this issue, he's terrific, and he's genuinely trying to push his party back to a
yeah,
sensible place. And I'm sure, I mean, though he's old and frail, would have been happy to, get on Zelensky's plane and go with him to
hmm
Scranton. But I like, but that's a critique of the management of Zelensky's image in the United States and Ukraine's image in the United States. It's not a substantive matter.
hmm none of this like actually matters. I mean, to be honest, if you look at like what's actually important and like thousands of people dying,
Well, except it is important in the sense that
yeah,
people like Johnson, you write a letter like that, and then it becomes harder the next time you have to stand up to your party and hold a vote on the next supplemental.
hmm
And, how do you do that once you've accused the Ukrainian government of election interference on behalf of the Democrats? And, you can really paint yourself into a corner with that stuff.
yeah, yeah. So
Ev, do you have more?
No, actually, I am about to leave. It was super interesting, but my phone is dying and I'm in my car, so I guess it will be. Is it like a recurrent or like thing that will happen often with Anastasia? How
We
actually?
are talking
Question, but
about
how do you pronounce
whether we should do this never again, occasionally, or regularly. And as you know, I'm very organized about these things, Ev, and plan things meticulously and leave nothing to impromptu decision making.
and I don't care or anything else. So
So we're gonna do what we do. Partly it depends
hopefully
how
it
people.
will happen.
Sorry.
So hopefully it will happen again, and we'll see each other soon. Ciao.
mhm.
I'm
Ciao.
about to die.
All right.
Bye.
That's when people sign off, when they're about to die, or when their phones are about to die. All right. So your turn, Nastya. What's on your mind this morning?
So much is on my mind. So I met two people, as I said, who worked in the White House, and they worked with the issues related to Ukraine and Russia. And we had a lot of conversations about the future of the war and kind of the peculiar situation that's happening right now with this victory plan. And I asked whether either of them have seen this victory plan. I mean, people have sources that show them confidential stuff, right? So I asked, and they kind of laughed, and one of them was like, I don't think there is a plan, to be honest, which okay, fair, because I mean everything that's in the victory plan, like nothing. Oh, okay, well, I haven't seen it. Okay, wait, I think Ava is awake. Yeah.
All right.
So
So Nastya is going to go get a special guest. And as you know, on Dog Shirt TV, we are very baby friendly. And hello. Do you want to introduce yourself? No, not ready for that yet. Who is this?
I think
Hi.
she's shocked.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Waking up is shocking. It doesn't actually get less shocking as you get older.
That's very funny. Ava, you're on a live stream. She's like,
She's like,
screw you.
I don't, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, well, so basically, I haven't seen the plan, so I don't know what's in it. But from everything that like Zelensky talked about publicly, and from everything that we know, nothing inside that plan is like new or kind of groundbreaking new strategy on the part of Ukraine. I'm freezing. Am I freezing for you as well?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but your audio is fine.
Okay.
So I'll tell you if it gets to be a problem, but it's fine for now. So all right. So I've always assumed that the victory plan is just a set of bullet points that reflect long-standing Ukrainian policy, as in give us more weapons, give them faster, remove restrictions, and let us win, which has been modified to let us get to a more advantageous negotiating position over the next 6 months, and then we'll be ready for whatever peace talks develop. Do you think there's more to it than that?
I mean, from every piece of analysis and reporting that I've seen so far, I think that's pretty much it. There is also some kind of general security long-term stuff, right? So something that would
let us join NATO.
Yeah, for example, Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, said that the NATO invitation is a part of the plan. But I mean, the long-term weapons thing is very interesting. Let me actually move back to the desk with her.
All right, we're going to see if Nastya can move and talk at the same time. It's like the walking and chewing gum experiment.
What is that experiment? What are you talking about?
Oh, I forget who it was who said about President Gerald Ford that he couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. But it was some wag, and it became a thing. Can so and so walk and chew gum at the same time?
Okay. So
we're going to use Ava in the rest of the show to evaluate her facial expressions, to evaluate the merits of what you're saying.
That's a terrible idea. I do not like that plan.
Okay, we won't do that.
So far, she is equally unimpressed as American shows apparently were. Okay. So we had this discussion about Ukraine's long-range weapons and how we're asking Americans to provide us with more, and how we want to hit all these targets in Russia, etc., etc. And so my colleagues, they're telling me, like, America, like, for example, if we're talking about ATACMS, they're like, America has like several hundred of those. Like, that's it. That's the stockpile. And to properly destroy like one big airfield and actually like hit it enough to destroy the target, you need like, I don't know, roughly 50. And so that math is, I mean, I'm sorry, ridiculous. So they were like, even if we lift all the restrictions, we like really just, it seems like we just don't have stuff to give you. And I'm like, okay, why is no one talking about this? I mean, people are talking about it, but they're not giving this math, because what people are talking about is like these broad strokes thing that make it sound like the US just doesn't want to do it for like no significant reason. Because they're like, I don't know, because this is the reporting. The White House is divided over the issue because the intelligence community says that there is uncertainty about whether the West can provide long-range weapons to Ukraine. And I'm like, well, that doesn't say anything. That just says that you guys are uncertain, and that's annoying.
Yeah, a huge part of the issue is actually the US's own stockpile. That these things take a really long. The US hasn't been on a war footing for defense production purposes in a very long time. I mean, we've fought wars, but we haven't fought wars that require ongoing, production in large numbers. And so
artillery
we're just not set up to produce stuff the way we were in World War II or in, even during Vietnam, where you have ongoing depletions. And so you build an economic industrial base around the idea that you need a certain number of shells a year. You need, and that number is big, and we're just not built that way right now. And so, even on relatively low grade stuff like artillery shells, which is the kind of bread and butter. It's not an esoteric weapon. It's not a high, it doesn't have advanced chips. It doesn't have all kinds of things in it. There's massive shortages of that stuff.
And I can also give you some numbers. So apparently, from what I've been told today, the US was producing, when the full-scale invasion just began, the US was producing around 20 to 30,000 of these shells, I think, per month. Correct me if I'm wrong. No, it's not per year. That can be right. I think it's per month.
Yeah, and the Russians are using like 500,000 a month or something.
Yes. And the Russians are going through 1 million shells in like 2 to 3 months. So, insane.
It's a huge problem. And the problem gets both better and worse as you climb the ladder of weapon system sophistication. So, it takes a long time to build an F-16 or an ATACMS or it's a like, that's actually, these are more bespoke systems, and we don't have an infinite number of them. The extreme example of that would be, of course, an aircraft carrier. But these are systems that we plan on over very long periods of time, and and surging production is a tricky business. Now, like, some of us have only a certain amount of patience with this argument, because what's the point of being the world's largest economy with the world's most powerful military if you can't be agile? And like, there's some point at which you say, as the president, I'm sorry, we're fucking doing this. Excuse me, Ava. You just say, we're doing this, and you get business leaders on the phone, you do what you have to do to make it happen. But the problem is real, and and you don't want to leave other parts of the American geographic footprint undefended. These weapon systems are created with very specific applications in mind. And if you send all the ATACMS to Ukraine, you do leave other places vulnerable.
Which, I mean, all of this is shocking to me. I mean, and it's not, well, okay, it's not like entirely shocking. I obviously knew that this was an issue, that the US was running low on stockpiles, but I always kind of assumed that, like, I mean, I guess I just didn't know like how big of an issue it was. And I thought that this was kind of like a thing that the US could just ramp up production and fix it. Because like, that's kind of the Ukrainian view of it. It's like, you have a problem with stockpiles because you have a problem with managing your stockpiles, right? But also, like, if that's the calculation, if genuinely we've been asking for ATACMS for so long and the US has like a few hundred, and they're also needed in other places. Like, wow, we're screwed. Like, we're in really big trouble.
But it seems like the other aspect of the victory plan, what that I think has gotten relatively little attention, that strikes me as important, is this idea of a 6-month horizon. That Zelensky seems to be saying, at least implicitly, we don't think we're going to, we think that both sides, i.e., including us, are going to be exhausted in the next 6 months. And the real issue here is not victory in the sense of liberating all the relevant territories over the next block of time, but getting ourselves into an advantageous negotiating position relative to where we are now. And that seems to me that's the one aspect of the plan, so to speak, that strikes me as genuinely different from what Ukrainian government officials have been saying in the past.
Yes, but I mean, still, there isn't a conversation nationally about any alternative. Like, the conversation is still very much centered around returning all of our territory, and the West being so terrible with not helping us achieve that goal. And something also included in the Substack this week is I suggested my readers read the latest piece from The Economist, which I think everyone listening to this should read. They released their latest issue with the front page crunch time for Ukraine. Yes, it's very sad. See, even my child is sad about it. I mean, it's kind of a very sobering article in a sense that the Economist has always had like the best takes on the war in Ukraine. Like, for years, they said that, you know, the West needs to invite Ukraine into NATO, and the West needs to give all the weapons, and Ukraine can win. Ukraine can win. So it was always very optimistic and, you know, top notch from a Ukrainian point of view. And then this time they released a piece saying that basically Ukraine is losing, and Ukraine just needs to admit the reality that there is just no resources either within Ukraine or outside of Ukraine to allow Ukraine to regain all its territory. So what it needs to do instead is think about how to live with that reality and how to live with that, right? And something really interesting that they said is like, Putin started the war not only because, you know, Russia is a neo-colonial power and has tried to destroy Ukraine for literally centuries, but also on a kind of smaller scale issue is the fact that Russia doesn't want to let Ukraine be prosperous and democratic, and they can't have that kind of example of a working democracy on their border. And so
this is a really important point in my opinion.
So The Economist was like, okay, you lose 20% of your territory, but you have the rest 80%. So how about like trying to get into NATO, which is a possibility apparently given the latest reporting, and then building a prosperous, democratic, Western-oriented, Western-integrated country with what you've got left.
Because it's basically the Cyprus model, although you know, just deal with the North later, build a prosperous economy, build a prosperous society now.
Yeah. And it's very interesting because I've never thought about that, to be honest. And I was very depressed about the fact that for months, everything just looked so bleak. Like, remember you and like that. You and I were talking about me writing this piece about like that Ukraine has no good options and it's like bad or worse and there's no way out. And then this piece by The Economist, I mean, it's obviously freaking tragic because like half of my family is from Crimea. So I'm going to be the first one to advocate for return of territories. I firsthand know what that is like, what occupation does to you. But at the same time, it's like sometimes it's just you gotta what is the phrase? You gotta work with the cards you have, right? So it's like, if this is the reality, then maybe you have to make it work somehow.
So, it may not be a matter of decision, in the sense that I find it very unlikely that there's going to be an agreement to, that these are not going to be the borders, right? These are maybe the armistice lines, or a ceasefire line, but there's no way that Russia is going to recognize. Uh, uh, there's no way that Ukraine is going to recognize Russian annexation of these territories. And similarly, there's no way that Russia is going to recognize Ukrainian uh, uh, territorial holdings in Kursk. And so these lines are at most a kind of temporary ceasefire line, and more likely, I think, a since I don't even imagine there being a ceasefire, I imagine there just being the fighting cools down to a level at which um, at which uh, it's a kind of more of a low rumble than a active shooting war. And you can imagine lots of levels at which it grumbles along. Think of the Israel Lebanon border prior to October 7th, right? Where you had 2006 to last year, where you would have occasional flare-ups, and bad stuff would happen both in southern Lebanon and in northern Israel, but you could have pretty normal life going on there. No one ever really said there wasn't a war, but there functionally was more low-grade hostilities than anything else. And when you have that, nobody has to recognize the legitimacy of anything, and you can do a certain amount of, all right, let's work with the state apparatus and territorial holdings we have, and we'll deal with getting the rest back later.
Yes, I'm gonna prove the experiment now. Though at the same time, what The Economist is advocating is for Ukraine to become a part of NATO. And if that happens, that means that we can't pretty much ever get our territory back, right? Because then that would be NATO attacking Russia. If we're like becoming a part of NATO, and then in 15 years or 10 years we want to try to get it back, then how's that going to work?
Yeah, I don't buy that. So first of all, NATO countries have fought wars against each other. Turkey and Greece in the in the 70s. People forget about the so-called Cod Wars, in which Iceland took on the British Navy and beat it. But intra-NATO fighting is rare, but it does occasionally happen. And NATO countries fight with other countries, particularly the United States, without dragging NATO into a war all the time. And if if Ukraine were to imagine the situation in which Ukraine were to join NATO, and then at some point were to do what Croatia did to the Serbian holdings in former Yugoslavia after the Serbo-Croatian War, and just blitz and take it. As long as NATO forces didn't participate in that, I'm not sure why that's any different from Ukraine outside of NATO doing that.
That's a good point. I don't know. I guess people think of NATO in these black and white terms, forgetting that there can be a lot of variety, right?
I mean, look, Turkey is part of NATO, and it is active militarily in Syria and Iraq on a fairly regular basis, and nobody says, NATO is attacking Syria and Iraq. They just understand that as a Turkish thing, and there are lots of countries in NATO that have pre-existing disputes that other countries in NATO find bewildering. And we don't look at those and say, hey, NATO is, a, combatant in French territories in Africa, where the French sometimes French former territories in Africa, like Chad or Mali, where the French sometimes operate. I just think when you bring countries into NATO, you do it with the understanding that some of them have, NATO didn't fight the Falklands War. So like sometimes NATO members have other conflicts that just don't implicate NATO's particular interests.
It's such an interesting time that we live in. As tragic as it is, I honestly cannot wait for, what is it, November 5th? I honestly cannot wait. I am so curious because I know it's kind of similar to like how you guys talk about the war. For me, it's just fascinating, and I'll grab popcorn and I'll watch it all night. But for you, it's like a life or death in some sense.
Yeah, for us, it's a little bit less popcorny and a little bit more stomachs in our throats. We've done this once before. It was a disaster then. It'll be worse this time.
Well, half of your country thinks otherwise.
Yes, well,
kind of like with us and Yanukovych, you were like, well, we didn't fully support you because what about Yanukovych? You guys elected Yanukovych. Well, y'all
Kuchma,
Trump.
Yeah, no. Look, I mean, any people around the world who want to say, I don't think we can do business with the United States because they could elect Trump a month and a half from now. I have no argument with that. Like we used to have two basically sane political parties, one of the center left and one of the center right. And now we have one center left political party and one, I don't know what to call it. People sometimes call it, I would call it sort of neo-authoritarian party. And I think that people around the world who aren't betting on the United States right now, that's a reasonable hedge. And the only thing I can say in response to it is and Ukraine is a good example of this. They're, frustrated with us and annoyed with us. There's no better bet, right? It's not like you can say, well, we'll put our faith in the European Union because the European Union, it's got Viktor Orban with a veto, and it's got, Slovakia, and it's not capable of producing weapons in the kind of volume that you guys need. And so the only thing to say in defense of the United States is that there isn't really a better option for freedom in the world right now. And that's not much to say. Like, I wish there was a time a few years ago at the beginning of the first Trump administration where people seriously said things like, Angela Merkel is now the leader of the free world.
I remember that. Yes.
And, nobody's saying that about Germany today. And so, like,
Germany's about to call Putin, by the way. Did you see that?
Scholz? No, sorry, what did you say?
Germany is about to call Putin. Scholz wants to talk with Putin for the first time since the full-scale invasion, I think.
That's...
Germany... Well, yeah.
Right. I mean, there's no other option. And so, Churchill used to say about the United States that it would do the right thing after exhausting all possible options. And the problem It's a good line. And there's a lot of truth to it. But the other side of that is that the rest of the world will not do the right thing even after exhausting all other options because they wait for the United States. And so, like, I do think we suck, but we're the only option, which is sort of a metaphor for the way Ukrainians think about us, I think.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly how we think about you guys. Like, we would love if it was, I don't know, some lovely country like Finland helping us, but they don't make shit as far as I'm concerned, right? So,
well, you got to get the Swedish planes, the Griffins, because they're actually the plane that Ukraine needs, and they're better for Ukrainian purposes than the F-16. Swedes and Finns actually both make really good weapons, but they make them in small quantities for their own purposes. So, message that we're going to close on to the Nordic defense industries: ramp up production.
yes.
And we are going to leave it there. Ava is now fully awake and ready to play.
Fully awake and ready to go back to sleep.
And this has been lovely. Come back sometime, Ava. Hey, folks, we will be back tomorrow in the afternoon, 4:00 p.m. with Alan Rosenstein.
Can I join that? He's fun. I love
him.
You
can join. We're going to talk about the vice presidential debate, which he promises not to watch tonight.
Oh my God, I'm so watching. Yeah.
We are going to talk about the vice presidential debate, which Alan promises he's not going to watch. And
suck.
And we're going to talk about Gavin Newsom's veto of the AI regulation bill in California. It's going to be great. And we will see you then. Bye, Ava.